This happened so long ago that the years have blurred in my memory. Sometimes it feels like it happened just yesterday, and other times like it was more than a decade ago. The memories, however, are vivid, deeply rooted within me, like roots that won't allow me to forget. My name is Eddie, and when it happened, I was 42 years old. I worked as a forestry engineer, and I loved my job. Working outdoors, amidst nature, was always a passion, even though it involved construction, which for many would be the opposite of preservation. I was assigned to a new project, a routine job. I had to supervise the clearing of a vast forested area for the construction of a new road. Something common, I had done it many times before. When I first set foot in that forest, I was immediately struck by its ancient beauty. It was a forest straight out of a fairy tale, its centuries-old trees rising so high that their canopies seemed to caress the sky. There was something sacred about that place, something that only now, upon reflection, I realize had already been warning me. In the first few days, I got lost in the vastness of the greenery, but there was something there, something beyond what the eyes could see. As I ventured deeper, I felt a strange sensation run through my body, a cold shiver that wasn't just indigestion or nerves. It was as if the forest itself was studying me. The sound of the wind through the trees carried murmurs, faint whispers that followed me with every step. Even the birds flying overhead seemed restless, and their songs, which would usually be a comforting melody, sounded like ominous warnings. I ignored these signs, clinging to rationality. It was just my job, another forest to be cleared, another road to be built. However, the atmosphere changed. The forest, once welcoming, became oppressive. Something was watching me from the shadows among the trees. At first, it was just sensations, that primal feeling of being observed, as if the very eyes of the earth were following me, hidden among the thick, moss-covered trunks. Nevertheless, I continued to supervise the workers, forcing myself to believe it was just my imagination. This lasted until the second week, when the first signs of something terrible about to happen began to manifest. I had decided to camp at the site near the area marked for clearing. I had always loved camping, sleeping under the stars, feeling the cool night breeze. But that night, the wind seemed to whisper something else. It was a sound I couldn't immediately make out, like an ancient and hoarse voice, filled with wisdom and rage, as if it was trying to warn me. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing feeling of madness, and entered the tent. Sleep? That was all I needed. The next morning, one of my workers disappeared. We formed a search party and scoured the forest for hours. The atmosphere, already strange, became even denser, suffocating. The forest seemed to toy with us, leading us down circular paths, confusing our senses. When we finally found the man, what we saw was something none of us could have imagined, something that haunts my dreams to this day. He was hanging from a tree, but not just hanging. His hands were fused to the trunk, as if the tree had absorbed him. His face, frozen in an expression of indescribable horror, was already beginning to merge with the moss and bark, as if he was becoming part of the forest. Terror took hold of all of us. I desperately tried to cling to rationality. Maybe it was an accident, a bizarre and inexplicable natural phenomenon. But deep down, I knew that something far more sinister was at play. That night, the wind howled louder. The trees, which once seemed distant, now leaned closer. I felt a presence. It wasn't my imagination. Shadows stretched, contorting into impossible shapes, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse as if the heart of the forest was alive and enraged. As the days passed, the deforestation continued, but at a cost. Every 2 or 3 days, a worker disappeared. Some, like the first, were found in grotesque states, fused with the wood, devoured by the forest. Others were never found. Terror gripped the group, and I began to realize that the forest was paying us back in kind, taking from us what we were taking from it. Then on the last night, under the silver light of the full moon, I finally saw it. I saw the trees move, I saw the twisted trunks bend, saw the branches stretch out like arms, and felt the ground open beneath my feet. Roots rose, wrapping around my legs, holding me. The cold of death enveloped my body, and a deep, raspy voice echoed inside my head, as if it came from the very bowels of the earth. You took life from us, now we take yours. I felt my body being pulled into the earth, the roots wrapping around me, my bones becoming part of the soil, my flesh fused to the trunk of a tree. The road was never built. The forest, with its ancient and vengeful power, triumphed. Today, I am just another shadow among the trees, a whisper lost in the breeze, waiting for those who dare challenge the wrath of nature. Traveling to remote places infested with mosquitoes, snakes, and other venomous creatures had always been part of my job as an environmental biologist. Since childhood, I had harbored an almost visceral fascination with wildlife, with plants and animals, and it was this passion that led me down the path of science. By the age of 31, I had traveled to numerous countries, exploring forests, deserts, and swamps. Each of these places held unique mysteries, small as if nature hid secrets in its shadows, waiting to be discovered. It was this thirst for knowledge that brought me to the heart of the Amazon, in search of a rare carnivorous plant, a species that bloomed only at night, luring small animals with irresistible nectar before devouring them. The journey was long and exhausting. After several flights and layovers, I had to cross wide rivers on rickety boats and finally paddle for hours through narrow, suffocating canals. The humid heat of the Amazon was a palpable presence, clinging to my skin as if the air were saturated with sweat and secrets. Along the way, the local boatmen shared stories. They were dark legends about the swamp, about guardian spirits that protected the place from strangers, about beings that wandered through the undergrowth on starless nights. I smiled politely, fascinated by the local traditions, but to me, they were just folklore. Ancient tales told to scare outsiders. I didn't believe them, of course. I was a scientist, and the natural world always had explanations, even if they were sometimes inexplicable at first glance. We arrived at the swamp in the late afternoon. The setting sun bathed the sky in orange hues, but down below, among the trees and waters, everything seemed gray, shrouded in a dense, mysterious fog. The swamp had an exotic beauty, almost repulsive to the unaccustomed, but I felt at home. The sickly sweet smell of decay, mixed with the scent of wet leaves and suffocating humidity, filled my lungs, connecting me to this place. To me, this environment was welcoming, a sanctuary of life and death coexisting in perfect balance. As my feet sank into the muddy ground, a growing anxiety gripped my chest. The plant I sought was here, somewhere, and finding it could be the pinnacle of my career. Yet, as I walked in search of a place to set up camp, I felt something more. Something dense and heavy in the air, something that made me glance over my shoulder, as if I were being watched. I dismissed the sensation, attributing it to the fatigue of the long journey. Perhaps it was jet lag, or just the excitement of the impending discovery. Night descended quickly, and with it, a heavy silence fell over the swamp. The sound of insects buzzing around seemed amplified, reverberating off the still waters. I sat by my small campfire, adjusting my research equipment, when I heard something. A muffled sound, distant, but undeniably unsettling. It was a scream, low and drawn out, coming from deep within the swamp. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just some nocturnal animal, maybe a bird or a monkey. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew louder, closer, and something within me began to stir, as if my body instinctively knew something my rational mind couldn't comprehend. The full moon cast a ghostly light over the landscape, reflecting off the stagnant waters and creating distorted shapes on the surface. That's when I saw them. Dark, elongated silhouettes emerging from the mist. Skeletal figures covered in moss and mud, slowly moving toward me. Their eyes, small glowing points, flickered with an ancient, deep hatred. They looked like beings made from the very vegetation, as if the swamp had created its own guardians, figures shaped from roots, mud, and dead leaves. Fear raced down my spine like an electric shock. I tried to tell myself it was just an illusion, perhaps a trick of light and shadows, but those things kept coming, and their eyes, those eyes. In panic, I stood up and tried to run, but the sodden ground felt alive, as if the swamp itself was trying to hold me back. My boots sank into the mud, each step a struggle. The figures were now just meters away, and the whispers I had previously ignored were now shrill, piercing screams, like 1,000 voices echoing from the depths of my mind. I fell, my body sinking into the cold mud, and as I tried to get up, I felt something grab my ankle. The swamp would not let me go. The figures approached slowly, like predators savoring the moment before the attack. Their hands, skeletal and coated with mud, touched my skin, sending waves of unbearable cold through my body. I screamed, but the sound died in the thick air. They dragged me through the mud, pulling me toward the dark, thick water where I knew there would be no escape. The smell of the swamp, once familiar, now suffocated me, invading my lungs as I sank. The icy waters enveloped me, and the last thing I heard, before the darkness consumed me completely, was the sound of a low, monstrous laugh, as if the swamp itself were mocking me. My research was never found. My body never returned either. The swamp, with its silent guardians, kept my secret forever, swallowing me whole as it had so many others who dared to challenge the mysteries of nature. Now I am just another shadow lost in the darkness, a story to scare the next adventurers who dare to venture into its treacherous waters. Life in the countryside had always been marked by hard work and constant sacrifices. I was born and raised on a farm and knew no other way of life. From the first rays of sun until the last traces of light on the horizon, my days were dedicated to the land, the animals, and the crops. Tending to the farm was like caring for a child that never grew up, always demanding more than you could give. But after nearly 50 years living this relentless rhythm, it was hard to imagine any other existence. Each season brought new challenges. When pests came or drought punished the land, we always found a way to survive. We never reached the point of starvation because there was something resilient in us, the farmers. If the harvest didn't yield enough, we found ways to make do with handcrafted work or helped out at neighboring farms. The key was to keep hope alive. Next season will be better, we'd say. And usually it was true. However, a few years ago, something changed. Time was no longer on our side. The land, once fertile and generous, began to wither in a strange way. It wasn't due to pests or drought. It was as if the soil itself had given up, refusing to bear fruit. The crops withered quickly, as if drained by an invisible force. Even with all my knowledge and experience, I couldn't understand what was happening. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Selling the farm started to seem like an inevitable solution. Maybe it was time to try life in the big city, something I had always avoided. It was during this time of despair that he appeared. On a stifling late afternoon, while I was watching the dry, hopeless horizon, I saw a car coming down the dirt road. It wasn't a typical vehicle for these parts. It was a large, classic car with elegant lines, something that seemed to belong to another world. Nothing like the trucks or tractors we were used to seeing. That car, with its shiny black paint, seemed to absorb all the light around it, like a moving black hole. The man who stepped out of the car was even stranger. Tall, slim, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that fit his body precisely. He wore sunglasses, even though the sun was almost setting. There was something inhuman about him, something disturbing that I couldn't quite place. As he walked toward me, the air around him seemed to vibrate, as if the very atmosphere rejected his presence. The animals on the farm reacted immediately. The horses started to neigh nervously, the cattle moved away from the fence, and even the usually apathetic chickens stirred in their coop. "Hello, Mr. John. How are you?" His voice was raspy, like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot, yet soft, almost sibilant. When he smiled, his teeth gleamed unnaturally, too white, too sharp. "I'm doing fine, sir. And you? What brings you to these parts? Are you lost?" My suspicion was evident, but I stared him down, trying to understand his intentions. The man let out a low laugh, a laugh that seemed to resonate from somewhere very deep. His mirrored sunglasses reflected my own face, but strangely, I couldn't see his eyes. "I came looking for you. I've heard about the troubles you've been having with the farm," he said, his voice carrying a tone of sympathy, though his thin lips curled into an animalistic smile. That chilled me to the core. How did he know about my troubles? I hadn't told anyone outside the area. "Yes, times have been tough," I replied, trying to maintain control of the situation. "So what do you want with me then? You here to buy the farm?" The smile on his lips widened, almost like a crack opening in his face. "No, Mr. John, buying the farm is not my interest. But I came to offer you a solution. A deal that could bring back the abundance and yield you once had. All for a small price, something you won't even miss." As tempting as his offer was, it filled me with a strange mix of curiosity and fear. What would be the price for this kind of help? "The fruit of your life, Mr. John," he answered with an eerie delight, as if he were offering me the greatest gift. Just that, nothing more. I hesitated, staring at him. His outstretched hand seemed unnaturally long, with thin fingers and sharp nails, more like claws. Despite the discomfort, the temptation to save my farm blinded me. Maybe he was speaking in metaphor, like city men often do. I thought he wanted a part of the future harvest, nothing more. So I shook his hand, sealing a deal I didn't fully understand. His touch was cold, and for a brief moment a shiver ran down my spine. The days that followed were nothing short of miraculous. The land, once dry and barren, began to flourish with terrifying speed. The crops grew vigorously, and the harvests were more abundant than they had ever been. My neighbors were amazed, asking what I had done to transform the farm so radically. But something was wrong. I could feel it. There was something alive in the soil. Something that pulsed, as if the ground itself was breathing beneath my feet. Then the night started getting strange. First came the sounds, low whispers almost inaudible that seemed to come from beneath the earth. Then shadows moved in the fields, tall, thin figures that crawled among the crops, watching me from afar with eyes that glowed in the dark. Every night I woke up feeling like I was being watched, the smell of soil permeating my room, as if the entire farm was trying to swallow me whole. That night, while inspecting the fields with my flashlight, something pulled me to the ground. The soil, which had once seemed stable, opened beneath my feet, and I was dragged into a dark pit. When I managed to turn around, I realized I wasn't alone. Others were there, their bodies dried and shriveled, as if the earth had drained all life from them. Their skin was like dead leaves, crumbling at the slightest touch. Farmers like me, who had made the same cursed deal. The earth had claimed its price. I had given up my soul, and now I was trapped there forever. The harvest had flourished, yes, but at the cost of my own life. Now I am just another ghost in the field, a body among the crops, waiting for the next fool to make the same pact. Life is too short to stay locked within four walls. From a young age, this idea followed me like a mantra, a force that pushed me out into the world. It was with this philosophy that I graduated in tourism and soon found my path as a mountain guide, where my passion for nature and adrenaline became a way of life. Exploring unknown peaks, feeling the sharp wind on my face, and the rush of scaling towering heights gave my life meaning. It was as if the vastness of the mountains reflected my own sense of freedom. Finding others with the same fascination for climbing was easy. Tourists and adventurers were always willing to follow my lead, trusting my experience. But no matter how many peaks I had climbed, there was one mountain that always intrigued and attracted me with an inexplicable force. Silent Mountain. It loomed majestically on the horizon, an immense shadow against the sky. From afar, its beauty was breathtaking, but there was something unsettling about it. No one dared to approach it, and those who tried, well, they say they never returned. That mystery only made it more appealing to me. Haunted stories about climbers who vanished without a trace circulated among the locals. Some spoke of a curse, others of spirits guarding the summit, but they all agreed on one thing. Silent Mountain was not a place to be challenged. It was dangerous, unforgiving, like a slumbering beast waiting for the right moment to devour anyone who dared disturb it. I had already led several groups of tourists to the outskirts of this mountain. I would show them the safe trails around it and tell the ghostly tales, mostly as a way to add a bit of thrill to their trips. Most were satisfied to observe the mountain from a distance, fascinated but comfortably far from its mysteries. However, on one full moon night, a group of wealthy tourists came to me with a different proposition. They didn't just want to observe, they wanted to climb to the top. They offered me a tempting sum, 3 times what I usually charged, and despite the warnings I had always given myself, the money spoke louder. The truth is, I knew I shouldn't have accepted. Silent Mountain wasn't like the others. It didn't forgive those who underestimated it, but their insistence and the amount offered made me ignore the signs. As we began our ascent, the atmosphere changed drastically. The air, once fresh and invigorating, became heavy, almost suffocating. Every step we took seemed to echo through the rocks, and the sound of the wind, which should have been familiar, took on an almost supernatural tone, a howl that seemed to carry distant voices. It felt as if we were being watched, as though invisible eyes followed us everywhere. And those eyes were not human. The animals that had initially accompanied us, birds flying overhead and small rodents darting across the path, vanished completely. The silence around us became oppressive, thick. All we could hear was the sound of our own footsteps and the wind, which seemed to gain a life of its own, howling through the rocks in an almost menacing way. On the first night, we camped near a peculiar rock formation. Its shadows cast by the moonlight seemed to dance, as if they had a life of their own. Exhaustion weighed us down, but unease kept us awake. The cold of the night seemed to seep directly into our bones, but there was something else that kept me from sleeping, a growing feeling that we were not alone. In the dead of night, I heard it. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, moving among the trees surrounding the camp. I left the tent with my heart racing, holding my flashlight. When the beam cut through the darkness, I saw tall, slender shadows moving in the distance. They looked human, but something was profoundly wrong with their shapes. They were distorted, disproportionate, and their silhouettes seemed to merge with the mountain itself, as if they were part of it. I stood frozen as those figures crept silently toward the camp. For a moment, the flashlight flickered, and when the light returned, the figures were gone, dissolved into the night. The next morning, panic began to set in. One of the tourists, Mark, had disappeared. His belongings were exactly where he had left them, but he himself was nowhere to be found. Following his footprints, we found tracks leading to a narrow crevice between two rocks. But the footprints ended abruptly there, as if he had been swallowed by the mountain. The tension in the group grew. Fear took hold of everyone. Whatever was happening here, I knew it wasn't natural. Silent Mountain was claiming its price. As we attempted to continue our descent, a sense of absolute terror surrounded us. The weather had changed drastically. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the wind blew with almost violent force. Suddenly, an avalanche of rocks began to tumble down from above, as if the mountain was hurling stones at us. We ran, but the ground trembled beneath our feet. And then, they appeared. The shadows, those same figures I had seen the night before, emerged from the rocks. Their bodies were grotesque, twisted, and their eyes, white, empty, glowing in the darkness. They moved like silent predators, surrounding us from all sides. The group panicked. We tried to run, but with every step, the mountain seemed to pull us down, as if it were alive, trying to absorb us. I ran as fast as I could, but it wasn't fast enough. The ground opened beneath my feet, and I felt something cold and wet pull me down. It was as if the mountain itself had hands, grabbing me, trapping me. When I looked up, the figures were all around me, their piercing eyes fixed on me. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the howling wind. Now, I am just another soul trapped in the depths of Silent Mountain, condemned to wander forever, waiting for the next group of foolish adventurers who dare to challenge its silence. As much as I have a deep passion for history, for the chronology of events that shape the present and the curiosity to delve into the secrets the past holds, I also recognize that many narratives of the past are shrouded in a veil of mysticism. The legends and myths that seep into human history, in times when fear of the unknown reigned, fascinated and still fascinate many scholars. What once was an expression of dread in the face of the incomprehensible eventually became a blend of distorted truths and superstitions. As a history teacher, my duty is always to separate fact from fiction, to rescue truth from the deceptions created by collective imagination. However, there is one story that, no matter how hard I tried, I could never completely strip of the weight of legends and mystery surrounding it. The story of the Countess's Lake. It is not just any legend. Something about the tragedy of Lillian, the supposedly betrayed countess, consumed me in a peculiar way. It was said that she drowned in the lake after discovering her husband Alfred's betrayal. The tale suggests that her spirit still roams there, luring unsuspecting souls to the treacherous waters, perpetuating her pain. The more I investigated the story, the more my curiosity turned into an obsession. I scoured libraries for records, examined reports from local residents, some filled with supernatural details, others clearly fantastical, but nothing was enough to quench my thirst for answers. When school vacation finally arrived, I decided it was the perfect time to uncover the truth for myself. I prepared a trip to the Countess's lake, determined to explore the region and unravel the mystery that had intrigued me for so long. The road there was isolated, surrounded by dense forests that closed in around the winding path. The heavy atmosphere of the place already began to envelop me before I even reached the edge of the lake. As soon as I caught sight of the water, I was overcome by a strange feeling of unease. The lake, surrounded by gnarled trees and the oppressive silence of the surrounding nature, seemed too calm, as if it held a dark secret just beneath the still surface. A fine mist had already begun to form at the bottom, hovering over the water like a cold shroud. Further ahead, the old Countess's mansion rose, its ruins tangled in vines and wild vegetation. The building was crumbling, slowly being swallowed by nature, as if even time itself wished to erase any trace of the tragedy that had occurred there. Fascinated by the history of the place, I didn't hesitate to explore the mansion. The air inside was thick and musty, saturated with the smell of decay and abandonment. The cracked walls seemed to whisper, and the wind passing through the broken windows created a ghostly melody. I could see old paintings still hanging in their gilded frames, worn by time but curiously preserved enough to reveal pale, enigmatic faces. One portrait in particular caught my attention. A woman of icy beauty, dressed in a fine white gown with sad eyes that seemed to follow my movements. Below the painting, an inscription, Lillian, Countess of Valmont. The sun was beginning to set when I left the mansion and returned to the inn where I would spend the night. The mist over the lake had thickened, and the waters reflected a silvery glow under the rising moon. As I walked to my room, I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, as if an invisible hand had touched my skin. That night, something even more disturbing happened. As I lay down, I heard a distant sound, a whisper that seemed to come from the lake. I got up, driven by curiosity and a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. I walked to the shore, trying to decipher what that sound could be. And then, I saw it. In the middle of the mist, a figure began to emerge from the waters. My heart raced as I realized it was a woman. Her skin was a terrifying white, her long dark hair dripping water, and her old-fashioned clothes were soaked, clinging to her body. The most terrifying thing was her eyes, empty, lifeless, but filled with pain. She walked slowly toward me, and I couldn't move. It was the face from the portrait in the mansion, the same sad gaze, but now distorted by suffering. "What did you do to me, Alfred?" Her voice came out in a drawn-out whisper, and even before I fully understood, I knew I was facing Countess Lillian. Her pain was palpable, and her lament echoed in my mind like a scream trapped in time. "Why did you leave me?" I tried to respond, to explain that I wasn't who she thought I was, but my voice refused to come out. The chain hanging from her ankle glowed with an ethereal light, a symbol of her eternal imprisonment at the bottom of that cursed lake. And then, she drew even closer, extending her hand. I felt the air around me grow denser, as if the very world was trying to pull me into the depths along with her. "I'm not Alfred," I finally managed to say, forcing my voice out. The instant those words left my mouth, her expression changed. What had once been sadness now transformed into fury. Her empty eyes filled with rage, and her voice grew louder, vibrating with hatred. "You will never leave me again, Alfred. Never again." The last word echoed like thunder, and before I could react, I felt her cold hands close around my collar. With inhuman strength, I was dragged into the water. The cold depths consumed my body, as the Countess, with relentless force, pulled me down. The icy water enveloped my limbs, and even though I struggled, I knew I was at the mercy of something far beyond my comprehension, and that Countess Lillian would never be alone in that lake again.